Alright, welcome to today's seminar, which is a joint seminar between Sasnet and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. Sasnet is a South Asian network here at Lund University, and we work at promoting and encouraging education and research on South Asia. We do that by holding seminars, as today. We do conferences. We have a conference in September. We hand out travel grants if you're a student and want to go to South Asia. So please check out our webpage and contact us if you want to know anything about South Asia and the connection between the university and universities in South Asia. But now let me introduce today's guest speaker, Professor Dennis McGilvray, who is a professor in anthropology at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Professor McGilvray has done fieldwork in southern part of India and Sri Lanka in over 4 decades. So really impressive. More specifically, he has done fieldwork among the Tamil-speaking communities in that region. Professor McGilvray has numerous publications in this area. For example, the book Crucible of Conflict, Tamil and Muslim Society on the east coast of Sri Lanka, which was released in 2008. Today's lecture will be some of Professor McGilvry's, namely Sufism in South Asia and the connection to the Middle East. So a warm welcome, Professor, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I'm going to stand over here, so I can operate my own slideshow. Let me first say thank you to Lund University and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies for hosting my visit. It's really so it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm particularly grateful to Andreas Johansson for being sort of the person who made it all possible. Andreas came to visit me in Boulder, Colorado. When was it?
2012.
Yeah. Anyway, so it's so nice. He's seen my hometown, and now I have a chance to see his. It's a pleasure to be here. Today, in this talk, I'm going to be talking about Sufism, starting from an unusual starting point for most Islamic studies scholars, I think. I'm going to be talking about Sufism and its connections from Sri Lanka and to Sri Lanka. And South India, as opposed to other parts of South Asia, where I think, well, many of you may be familiar with the large body of scholarship on Sufism connected to North India and Pakistan. Now, this may be extremely elementary, and I apologize if you know all of this, but I don't know quite what my audience might already know about Sufism. So I'm an anthropologist. I'm not an Islamic studies scholar. I'm not a specialist in Sufism, theologically speaking, and I don't read Arabic. But I do ethnographic work in Sri Lanka and South India amongst Muslims. And one of the things that I do observe and take an interest in is popular Sufism. That is the Sufism that is practiced by ordinary people. And so I just want to be sure that everyone has some working sense of what I mean by Sufism, popular Sufism. So these are like 5 points that I think most people would consider to be very central to Sufi practice in any part of the world. I don't think this is uniquely South Asian at all. Sufism is the mystical branch of Islam, where you're being introduced to what are thought to be deeper messages and meanings in Islam, that deeper than what one would simply get by reading the Quran. You need a guide and someone who can break the code, the secrets of Islamic scripture. And to do that, you need a sheikh, you need a preceptor, a teacher, who guides you. So Sufi orders are mystical orders into which you are initiated by someone who's your sheikh or your teacher, and through him you achieve a kind of mystical awareness that you would not otherwise achieve. You do that in part by weekly meetings. Usually it's a Thursday night, which would be the beginning of Friday in the Muslim calendar, the holy day of the week. And the practice or the performance that is typically done is called zikr or dhikr, and it varies from order to order depending on which branch of Sufism you follow. And I think most of my students in Boulder, if they've heard of anything Sufi, they probably have heard of the whirling dervishes, the Maghrib order in Turkey, which are the wonderful performances in the tall hats and the skirts, and they turn, they spin to the sound of an orchestra, actually. Well, that's their form of zikr. In other parts of the world, the performances are different depending on which order and which sheikh you follow. The other thing which is extremely important in popular Sufism is the veneration of saints who are buried in tombs or tomb shrines that are typically called dargah or mazar, and there's other words for them as well. But it's a tomb in which the body of the deceased sheikh, famous holy man, has been buried, and the dargah itself is like the home of a living saint still. He's deceased, but he hasn't left this world. His power is there, and you can go to the dargah, you can achieve blessings, and you can make vows, and you can even hope for some miracles to be performed. And the big event at those dargahs is what in North India would be called an urus, Arabic word for wedding, actually. The wedding meaning the death anniversary of the saint. In South India, in my area of Sri Lanka and southern India, they don't use the word urus, they use the word kanduri, which is just it's a Persian word meaning a feast, a festival. So that's sort of what Sufism looks like on the ground ethnographically, to me as an anthropologist and ethnographer. Now, since we're talking about Sufi connections, and this talk is being hosted by the Middle Eastern Studies Center, I just want to start out very importantly by pointing out the first Sufi is thought to have been the Prophet Muhammad. That is, he achieved a kind of unity or closeness to Allah that latter-day Sufis today would all try to hope or somehow achieve some partial equivalent to. So, in some sense, Sufism originates in the Middle East with the Prophet Muhammad, and this is, of course, a lithograph representation of his tomb in Medina. All Sufi orders in some way trace their origins back to Muhammad, either through one of the close companions of the Prophet, such as Abu Bakr, or to perhaps the son-in-law of the Prophet, Imam Ali. So it all begins in the Middle East, but Sufism travels. It's an incredibly peripatetic traveling form of Islam, and so we're going to see where it goes. Part of the way that membership in Sufi orders is reckoned and legitimized is through what is called a silsila, or a chain of initiations. Silsila can also refer to the genealogical chain of ancestry back to the Prophet Muhammad or members of his close family. And if you are a member of that line of patrilineal descent from the Prophet, you could call yourself a Sayyid, or in Sri Lanka they would call themselves Maulanas, descendants, direct patrilineal descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. Silsila also can mean the chain of initiation. That is, the chain of initiation into one Sufi order and then the transmission of that membership to the next generation down through time. So there are two chains, so to speak, and to be a Sufi you don't have to be a Sayyid, you don't have to be a descendant of the Prophet, but if you are, that's even better. That's an additional qualification. So here's a modern day silsila of a family that traces its biological descent back to the Prophet Muhammad, but a silsila of initiations would be the same type of document. Now, if you've heard of any kind of Sufism in South Asia, I bet it will be the Sufism that is so popular in Pakistan and North India, where the order of the Chishti Sufi order is particularly prominent. And if you're music fans, you, I'm sure, have heard the wonderful Qawwali music of performers such as Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, incredibly musically catchy and exciting Sufi music. And you may have even heard of a place like this, Ajmer in Rajasthan, which is where one of the very most famous Chishti sheikhs is buried. So this is North Indian Sufism. This is what I think most scholars initially would think of when they talk about this Sufism in South Asia. But I am going to take you to the other end of the subcontinent. And we're not going to have a chance to listen to wonderful music like this Qawwali singing group, which is fabulous, but they don't do Qawwali in Sri Lanka, they do other kinds of music. So I thought it would be interesting to sort of see where the Sufi connections from South India and Sri Lanka go. And so here's the region that I work in. I'm an anthropologist, so I have a fieldwork site that I've been working in for decades. It's over here on the eastern coastline of Sri Lanka. I've actually done fieldwork along the Tamil coast in South India as well, so I'm not exclusively a Sri Lankanist, but primarily a Sri Lankanist. And I work in Tamil, the minority language in Sri Lanka, but majority language in the state of Tamil Nadu in South India. And I don't work exclusively with Muslims either. Most of my anthropology is divided between Tamil-speaking Hindus and Tamil-speaking Muslims, both of whom we find in this eastern region of Sri Lanka. So again, some of you probably know the demographics of the situation, but I think it's useful just to remind ourselves. In Sri Lanka, there are three large ethnic communities, and the Sri Lankan flag is like a diagram of the ethnic composition of the country. The big panel on the Sri Lankan flag here represents the majority community, the Sinhalese-speaking Theravada Buddhist community, the Sinhala people, the people of the lion, so-called because they trace descent legendarily from lion ancestry. And then the flag has two stripes here that represent the Tamil-speaking minority communities. Hindus represented by orange or saffron, I guess, and green stripe representing the Muslims. As I say, the area of the island that I work in the most is on the east coast. Andreas mentioned my book, but I always have to put a plug in for my book in case anyone wants to read it. So Crucible of Conflict is my ethnography of this easternmost region of the island. So this is now going to be a kind of a quick visit to several different popular Sufism, sites of popular Sufism, I should say, or social situations of popular Sufism. And we're going to start with what I'm calling rural Sri Lankan Sufis. That is the kind of lay Sufi practices that I ran across in eastern Sri Lanka, and I think you'd find them in other parts of the island as well. The most common, most widespread Sufi order is called Qadriya. They take their name from the founder of that order, Abdul Qadir Jilani. He's a 12th century Sufi of Persian origin, actually, but he's buried in Baghdad, in Iraq. And that's where his tomb is today. So the Middle Eastern connection to these Sufi orders is absolutely clear. Qadriya goes back to, ultimately, to Persia and Iraq. I think Qadri is probably the largest Sufi order in the world, as far as I can tell. It's just like everywhere there's Qadiriyas. To commemorate the tomb shrine of Abdul Qadir Jilani, the founder of the order, since anthropomorphic representation of sacred people is pretty much forbidden in Sunni Islam, maybe not so much in Shia Islam, but in Sunni Islam you wouldn't have a picture of the saint, but you would have a picture of his tomb. So it was interesting to me to realize that for the Hindus, of course, pictures of deities, Hindu gods and goddesses, I mean, they're everywhere. But for Muslims, to want to sort of have an icon or something to remind them visually of the Sufi saint, you don't show him, you show the tomb itself. So this is supposedly an artistic representation of what Abdul Qadir Jilani's actual tomb looks like in Baghdad. And I have no idea whether this is in any way a good representation of it. I doubt that it's pink and colorful like this. But I saw this picture on many people's homes and walls in Sri Lanka, indicating their membership or loyalty to Jilani. When I went to Sri Lanka as a graduate student, I had no awareness of Sufism and no research focus on it whatsoever. But having, as Andrea said, worked there for 4 decades, I eventually bumped into it, or it bumped into me. And the person who really got me interested in Sufism is this gentleman, a retired school teacher, Zain Master. And he took an interest in teaching me his interpretation of what Sufism was all about. I took copious notes on this, but I always wondered whether he was giving me anything like an officially correct interpretation of basic Sufi concepts. But later, as I read more about Sufism, I came to realize that he's pretty much spot on. I mean, it was pretty good, what he was teaching me. It certainly fit with things I subsequently read about. And it was fun talking with him, as he sort of became my sheikh a little bit and taught me. And what he taught me is what happens at a typical weekly zikr session in this agricultural town of Akarepattu that I do a lot of my field work in eastern Sri Lanka. So he took me to some of these sessions, which happen, as I say, on Thursday nights. And they start around 10 p.m. and they may go to 2 a.m. Although it's men you see in this picture, in some cases there's a woman's Sufi circle too, just outside the frame of this photograph, maybe behind a fence or behind a small screen. So it's not exclusively a male religious practice, although what you see publicly tends to be male. And they sit in circles, there'll be a leader, and it involves, the zikr may be involving kind of repetitious chanting of La ilaha illallah or something like that, or Allahu, Allahu, some kind of, well, I mean, I don't want to give it a Hindu name, but it's like a mantra. I mean, it's a phrase that you repeat over and over again until you become sort of hypnotized and ecstatic and carried away by the emotion of the recitation. These are in no way professional Sufis. These are just laymen who on Thursday night do this. The next day at 12:30 they'll go to the Jummah mosque and pray as ordinary Muslims would. Once I got interested in Sufism and I started asking about it, then I learned about things that no one had bothered to tell me. For example, I can recall when I was in the field as a younger scholar, asking Muslim friends of mine if any of them were Sufis. And surprisingly, practically no one knew what the word meant. it didn't ring a bell. That Sufi, what is a Sufi? Only later did I understand that I was asking the question the wrong way. What I should have asked is not, are you a Sufi, but do you have a sheikh? Do you have a teacher? When I asked that question, they'd say, I don't know what a Sufi is, but yes, I've got a sheikh. So that was sort of a kind of a revelation to me too, because then it turned out that many people that I had known do indeed have some relationship to a teacher, to a sheikh. And then when I started asking more about sheikhs and where they are and who they are, I learned that there are actually sort of a whole group of famous sheikhs in the history of 19th and 20th century Islam in Sri Lanka. And this photo board, sort of pin-up board of photos and drawings of famous Sufi sheikhs that have in some way had an impact in Sri Lanka, was given to me. He didn't give me the board, but he let me take the photo. This is the fellow who put the whole board together. He's got his name up, his picture up there too. He's one of the great sheikhs, but he's also put up the pictures of the sheikhs that he thinks are also important. And it's organized in a fairly random way, and if anyone really wants to know who all these people are, I can email you from my field notes. I can't remember them all. But this guy is one of the historically most important. This is Abdul Qadir Hyderabadi. He came from Hyderabad, India, and initiated some Sufis in Kailapartnam, is a coastal town in southern Tamil Nadu, and his students, the sheikhs that he initiated, then came to Sri Lanka. And some of the current leading sheikhs in Sri Lanka today are all trace their silsila back to Abdul Qadir Sufi, Hyderabadi. And then some of these, like this is, I think, supposed to be Ibn Arabi, the Sufi philosopher who is the inspiration of a lot of popular Sufism in Sri Lanka. And this is supposedly Muinuddin Chishti, the person buried in that Rajasthan dargah that I showed you a photograph of earlier. In addition to the sort of chanting of zikr, another kind of zikr that I came across and found quite interesting was a musical zikr. This is a zikr that's performed by members of another Sufi order called Rifai. Now you have to understand, you can be members of more than one Sufi order. Sufi orders can be multiple. So these people would probably say, I'm Qadiriya, but I'm also Rifai. And to be a Rifai Sufi, one of the things you do is a kind of call and response singing in praise of the saint, Rifai, who is also buried in Iraq, using the tambourines. And this was very sort of emotional performance that I observed, and in fact did record some of it. If it was really high tech, I'd have a sound file and let you hear it. But so this is as close to sort of the musical Sufi tradition that I ever came to in Sri Lanka. I've never heard anything as musical as Qawwali music or as catchy. This was much more mournful, very emotional kind of singing that rose and fell and rose and fell. But it wasn't dance music. It isn't the sort of like Qawwali music you can use it as workout, for gymnastics too. It's got great rhythm. Yes?
Yeah, what about body movements? Are there any
Yeah. Kneeling and then going forward and back. I think at one point they all stand up and sit down. I can't remember exactly the sequence, but then it's repeated again and again. That musical tradition in the Rifai order seemingly came historically through a connection from this island off the west coast of India in the Lakshadweep island chain. When I was talking with these guys doing the music, I said, well, where'd you learn this? And they said, oh, it comes from a place in India. And I said, what place? And he said, I don't know, it's a Tivu, some kind of Tivu, which means, in Tamil means island. Yes, Andhra Androth Island. And indeed, that musical tradition is strongly represented in Lakshadweep. And the teachers of this musical tradition, they take the boat from Androth to Cochin, or Androth to Calicut, take the train to Trivandrum, take the airplane from Trivandrum to Colombo, where they are met with a nice Mercedes-Benz car, and usually taken on tour where they have disciples and students who learn their tradition. A Sufi that I got to know and still know quite well in my research is this gentleman who was a former art teacher in the government school in Akrebatu. I knew him as a young graduate student as Mr. Majid. Makatar Majid, everyone called him. But over the years, he has transformed himself from an art teacher in the public school to a Sufi sheikh. So he's no longer Makatar Majid, he's now Makatar Vapa. Vapa means father in Muslim Tamil in Sri Lanka. So he's Father Makatar. And here he is blessing one of his murids, or followers, who are members of his local Sufi order. He also traces his biological or genealogical descent from the Prophet Muhammad. So he's one of these Sufis that wants both the silsila connection to his initiating sheikh, who initiated him, but also wants to trace back a kind of family tree to the Prophet Muhammad. So the ancestor he is closest to is buried in this tomb in the town mosque in Akrebatu. And he is represented on this kinship diagram. Excuse the anthropology, arcane anthropology symbols here, but some of you would know. Triangles are males, circles are females. And there was a migrant sheikh named Sheikh Ismail from Yemen, from Hadramaut or some part of Yemen. Probably came to Sri Lanka in, well, I don't know exactly, but probably late 18th century, early 19th century. Had many, many, many kids, many, many different wives all over the island. But one of his children, one of his many children, was Abdul Samad, who had two wives, and children, therefore, in two different family lines. My Sufi sheikh is Makatar here, this triangle. And the interesting thing to me was that here is a Sufi who wants to trace his descent back to the Prophet Muhammad, but inconveniently enough, there is no pure line of male ancestry. Instead, there are intervening females between grandpa here and grandson, both on his mother's side and on his father's side and on his wife's side. But this is not a problem for Makatar, because the eastern part of Sri Lanka is matrilineal. They trace descent through women, and marriage is matrilocal. Wives, the husbands come and live in the wife's house. So there's a strong sort of matrifocal, matricentric culture in the eastern coast of Sri Lanka. And Makatar tells me, he says, you know what, this is our local culture. I can trace my descent this way, through women, doesn't matter. So it's kind of an interesting variation on a typically strongly patrilineal ideology in most of the Muslim world, where this would be considered an irregular descent pattern. The other thing about Makatar, which I find very appealing, is that he likes high-tech. Well, I mean, if you think a cell phone is high-tech. So every time I've ever been to visit him, I see this fellow every time I go to Eastern Sri Lanka. And every time I go, he's got a new model cell phone. So what does he do with the cell phone? Well, he gets calls from all over the world. He'll be sitting there, the phone will ring, and there'll be somebody in Copenhagen or somebody in New Zealand who considers him their sheikh. And he gives advice over the cell phone internationally. But if his disciple has an ailment of some kind, say elbow, pain in the elbow or knee, he'll tell the disciple, okay, now you hold your cell phone against your elbow. I will recite into my cell phone and transmit the effects of my recitation, which is prayer, and will go directly to your elbow through the cell phone. So it's kind of remote medicine via the cell phone using this technology. Okay, so that's sort of ordinary or lay Sufism that I saw a lot of in Sri Lanka. Another branch or kind of Sufi situation are what I'm calling urban Sufis. And by that I mean Sufi traditions that are found in the port cities mainly. Colombo, of course, capital city of Sri Lanka, international port. Also Gaul, in southern Sri Lanka. And any of the sort of major coastal ports that have significant Muslim business, mercantile interests. Veruela, for example, which is a gem trading town right on the coast. I found that another order was very commonly found that in Sri Lanka they called Shazulia, which I think is just another name for Shadliya, which is a very common urban Sufi order originating in, I think, Morocco or Tunisia. And even today, the leaders, the senior sheikhs in the Shazulia order that come to Sri Lanka, at least, come from Cairo or now more recently from Jeddah. So there is a active Middle Eastern circuit that the Shazulia leaders follow, and these people will come to Colombo once or twice a year, visit their disciples, and pass on blessings and teachings to them. I'm not a historian, but I have strong suspicions that Shazulia and these mercantile Sufis grew in Sri Lanka during the British period of the 19th century, when the empire enabled trade both with the east coast of Africa and the Middle East, as also with Malaya and with Southeast Asia. So this is another sort of stream of Sufism, all seaborne by mercantile trade across the Indian Ocean. The Shazulia orders meeting places in places like Colombo. Some of them are just amazingly lovely old buildings. They're usually called a zavia. The Shazulias will call their meeting house a zavia. And some of them, like this, built somehow in the late 19th or very early 20th century, have this wonderful sort of Victorian look to them, and are historically really important. And they too, these are meeting houses that will often have tombs associated with them of local sheikhs who have died and have been enshrined in or near the zavia. And then there are, if that was sort of the mother zavia you saw earlier, this would be a branch meeting house. This is in Gaul, in the Gaul fort. And again, it's the Shazulia Tariq. Tariq is the name of is the word for the order. So it's the Shazulia Tariq, and this particular meeting house is named after Fassia. Sheikh Fassi is the current leader from Jeddah who comes to Sri Lanka and meets with followers. The people who are very active in the Shazulia order tend to be sort of the civic leaders of the Muslim community in places like Colombo. And although I don't know for sure whether these individuals themselves are currently or had been members of the Shazulia order, I strongly suspect that many of them were. These are the past presidents of an association called the Moors Islamic Cultural Home. And this is sort of a cultural association, cultural center for, particularly for urban Muslims in Colombo. They have a library, and they have an orphanage, and they have a lot of outreach, sort of social service activities. But what I found interesting was the fact that almost all of the prior presidents of this association are wearing the fez cap. Again, suggesting a strong connection to a Middle Eastern cultural inspiration, even though, of course, the fez cap itself is not Arab, it's Turkish, it's Ottoman. But during the British period, there was a famous exile who came to Sri Lanka from Egypt. The British expelled him from Egypt, having lost this revolutionary uprising, and he arrived with everyone wearing a fez cap, and fez became sort of the uniform for dignified urban Muslims in Sri Lanka, which helped them sort of identify with the Arab world as a source of cultural and religious inspiration. I'll talk a little bit more about that aspect of this thing in my talk I'm giving tomorrow about Muslims and Buddhists. A third kind of Sufism that I encountered in Sri Lanka were the Bawas. Bawa, or in North India it would be Baba, meaning a father, really. The Bawas are fakirs. They are semi-professional Sufi mendicants who are not full-time Sufi fakirs, but they are, during this festival season, 3 or 4 months out of the year, they're on the road in troops, and they go from mosque to shrine, performing in public their form of Rifai Sufi zikr. And again, Rifai is buried, as I say, in Iraq. He very much a contemporary of Jilani. They're both sort of simultaneous Sufi sheikhs from the Middle East. The Rifais are famous for their ecstatic and rather wild zikr. The fakirs, the beggar, the mendicants who perform, their zikr is pretty wild, I have to say. Here's one of them getting ready for a performance. The red flag is the Rifai order flag. They raise the red flag of the Rifais. And then at sort of annual festivals at certain shrines around the island, they perform, usually late at night, from about 11 o'clock onwards. And you notice that they're arrayed here in front are a lot of implements of torture, seemingly, a lot of shish kebab spikes and swords and various implements of self-mortification. The Rifais are famous for self-mortifying themselves and showing that the saint can protect them from harm, even though these are really pretty dangerous looking implements. So there's needles that are put through the cheeks. These are spikes that have a kind of spherical top and then a long metal spike. And those get jammed into their scalps, and the worst to watch was into the eye socket. I saw that once. I'm not gonna terrorize you with pictures of that, but it is quite amazing, and people watch it because it's a spectacular performance of religious devotion. It's done with musical accompaniment, singing by the Sufi order with the tambourines. And the leader of the troop, the Khalifa here, he'll bless the implements before they're used. So here, this man is going to perform, and so he's bringing the implements forward, and the Khalifa, or the leader of the group, is blessing them with his saliva. Again, this is fairly common in the Sufi world, where the saliva of the holy man, because it comes from the mouth, and the mouth is where the blessing emanates, the saliva becomes a way to transmit the blessing to the implement. So different from Hindu ideas about saliva. I don't know if you know about this, Andreas, but the Hindus, the word for saliva in Tamil is echil. And my Hindu friends, when I said the word saliva, echil, they were just sort of cringe. You know, like, oh, it's awful, it's very polluting. But the Sufis thought the echil was the way to get the blessing. So really different sort of interpretation of the same thing. I'm not going to show you those eye socket pictures, I promise I won't. Now to be more transnational, let me turn to Tamil Nadu. This is the Indian state just on the other side of the water from Sri Lanka, the closest state to Sri Lanka. And if you look at this map, I've highlighted, well, 6 very famous dargas, Sufi tomb shrines, along the South Indian Tamil coast. There are many more too, even smaller ones, but these are big ones that people in Sri Lanka would know about. And many of them, if not today, at least in the generation of their parents and grandparents, they would have gone on pilgrimage to some of these shrines. And so these are sort of historic Tamil tomb shrines that, even today, represent an important source of Sufi saintly blessing and vow making for Sri Lankan Muslims. The most famous of which is Nagur. When I first did fieldwork in Sri Lanka, I found older men had personal names, Muslim names like Nagur Tambi, little brother of Nagur. Nowadays, that's a kind of a name you wouldn't hear so much in Sri Lanka. The names have become Islamified, I guess you'd say. But Nagur apparently was always a big shrine for Sri Lankan Muslims. And it is an amazing place. It's the biggest dargah I have ever seen in South India. Maybe there's one bigger in Hyderabad, but along the coast, it's I'm pretty sure, the biggest and most impressive. And it was built over the years, starting in the 16th century, with the help of Hindu kings of Tanjore. The Maratha kings of Tanjore actually built some of the towers, because the kings wanted to be patrons of all religious traditions, and if the Sufi saint could be of help to their royal dynasty, they would support that as well. So the saint buried there is Shaul Hamid. He's a historic figure, died in 1579. And so all of this has come up, since then. It's a shrine that's built very close to the sea. This is the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal. And the saint is thought to be very, very useful in protecting merchant ships from storms and catastrophe. He's a kind of a maritime saint. And a lot of the symbolism of the shrine is maritime, including, I don't know if you can see it, but at the top of the towers, this is the festival period, so the flags are flying, and this is like ships, what do you call it, the netting, the mast, what do you call it, that tie it to the mast, and it's like ropes that you use to climb up from the deck up to the top of the mast. And it's put up for the festival as a kind of indication of the maritime tradition. The shrine itself is quite well endowed with lands, and there's lots and lots of pilgrims, not all of whom are Muslim, by the way. There are a lot of Hindus who come to this shrine. And try to achieve some blessing from being close to the saint. And like many similar shrines in India, although not so much in Sri Lanka, but in India it's common in places that the descendants of the saint, the family of the saintly person himself, still owns the shrine or just manages the shrine. So here is the current incumbent of the Nagur shrine. He will trace his silsila, his genealogical connection, back to the saint himself. So it's like a family corporation with shareholders, members of the family, the saintly family, having rights to the revenue of the shrine. They bring sandalwood annually at the Urus or Kanduri festival and smear the tomb with sandalwood. This is the sandalwood chariot. And because it's a maritime saint, they have a wonderful parade of boats. Just amazing, including some really big floats that are made to look very much like boats, including a lot of the smokes coming out of the smokestack of the steamer. The saintly transoceanic aspect of this is continued then in what people call, well, in English they'd say, it's like a branch office. Main office is in Nagur, branch office overseas. So here's Nagur, and then branch office in Sri Lanka, branch office in Penang, and branch office in Singapore. And when the flag goes up in Nagur, it goes up simultaneously in Penang and Sri Lanka and Singapore. So this is the maritime routes that the Muslim traders used, and that the money that they made helped to support that dargah. At the branch offices, there's what you might call a virtual tomb. There's no body, but it's like a tomb, like a grave. It's just sand, but the saint's presence is virtually there, spiritually there. People will make vows to raise flags. Excuse me, didn't want to do that quite yet. Flags that go up annually at the flag raising ceremony as a fulfillment of a vow to the saint. And these get stitched every year new as a vow fulfillment. They raise them like this. Very distinctive flag. I was trying to figure out where the design of this flag comes from. It looks almost Chinese in a way to me. And then here's Penang in Malaysia. This is the branch office of the Nagur saint there. And this is Singapore. In Singapore, the conservative Muslims, or should we say fundamentalistically minded Muslim community, has basically closed the shrine down and forbidden them to have celebrations because they consider it non-Islamic. So it's turned it now into a Singapore Muslim cultural center, museum, rather than an actual shrine. Well, we're almost at the end of this talk. I just wanted to end with a kind of unexpected transnational Sufi phenomenon. All of the examples we've given so far, you could trace the Sufi tradition coming from the Middle East to South Asia and then being disseminated to local Sufi orders, either in South India or in Sri Lanka. But there is one 20th century Sufi saint whose origins are completely mysterious. His birthplace is unknown, his age unknown. He is known as Bawa Muhyiddin, or popularly as Guru Bawa. He's a Sri Lankan, or at least he came to be known in Sri Lanka. Whether he is of Sri Lankan origin, we don't know. He just appeared, apparently, as a grown person. He had a following, he attracted a following, a Sufi following as a sheikh in Sri Lanka, but also attracted American students from Philadelphia, particularly from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, who would come to Sri Lanka to study with him, to be at his feet. And ultimately, they persuaded him to move to Philadelphia. So he went back and forth from Colombo to Philadelphia, and then ended up staying in Philadelphia, where he died in 1986. And even today, if you go to baomohideen.com or some such website, you'll find the organization still exists. They have a fellowship, they have a publication series, and his body, excuse me, is buried. Here's what he looks like, a very sort of hypnotic face. He spoke Tamil. He never spoke English, as far as we know. He sang, he did artwork, he spoke in Tamil and always had a translator translating for the American English-speaking audience. And when he died, they built a lovely little dargah for him outside of Philadelphia, where he's buried today, and where they celebrate his death anniversary. So, just an interesting twist on the Sufi Sri Lankan scene, a Sufi from Sri Lanka who attracted a following in the West. That's my talk. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't gone too long on this, but I would love to take questions and comments from any of you.
Right, thank you. Any queries?
Sure. Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I was thinking about this issue with the matrilineal system, which is very interesting that you mentioned, and then the connection with the Middle East. Would you say that the Sufis in Sri Lanka came there not via North India, but more by the traders from south, directly from, yes. And you also mentioned the islands, the Laccadites, and as far as I know, it's a matrilineal system there, and also in South India and Kerala. Are there other matrilineal features among Sufis in other parts of the world, or is this specific for? And do you think that these features, did they come from the Laccadites, or did they actually came from the Middle East via Somalia or whatever it could be? Because there are also some matrilineal people.
There are.
I think that would be interesting.
I wish we knew the answers to these questions.
You don't.
I rather doubt that its origins are in the Middle East. My hunch would be that the origins, if you need an origin place, it's Kerala, and the Lakshadweep Islands are very closely culturally connected to Kerala, and those are both matrilineal places. Interestingly, though, I believe if you go to Sumatra, you will find some matrilineal Muslim communities there, and there's an anthropologist with whom I've been corresponding, a junior scholar. He isn't working in Minangkabau, but it's someplace in central Sumatra where he too has found tracing descent, Sufi, a membership matrilineally. So it's not, I mean, I think it's rare, but it's not totally unique as far as I know. And my man is the only one so far that I've come across who actually makes the argument. Most of the other Sufi sheikhs can manage to figure out a way to trace their descent patrilineally, even though it is a matrilineal social system.
And it is that you could see women inside the shrines. Is that also typical for those matrilineal Sufis, or is that in general that they can mix, you can see gender mix?
It's like the Nabur shrine, women are always going in, but they cannot go all the way. There is a threshold. So men can step over the threshold and circumambulate the actual tomb of the saint. The women can only come up to the threshold and look, but cannot step over. But I think my experience has been that, well, it's true of all religious shrines, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, the women are often the most devout of the pilgrims, even though in many cases they don't have the same rights and privileges that the men do.
And they still practice matrilocality or not? Do you know that?
In Sri Lanka, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that actually is, that's my current project. The matrilineal tracing is beginning to die out a little bit in Sri Lanka because it no longer matters so much. I mean, there are some mosques still that in Akrapatu where the management of the mosque is by, it's by men, but men who hold the office by virtue of their matrilineal descent. So the matrilineal thing is still there to some degree with mosques, and it's definitely there with some Hindu temples as well. But that I can see in another generation or two that probably, I wouldn't be surprised if that gradually fades away. But what isn't fading is matrilocality. That is the idea that a woman owns a house, and to get married she needs a house, and if she doesn't have a house she's in trouble because it's hard to get a husband if you can't provide a house for him. And that's going on just as strongly now as it did 30, 40 years ago when I first went there. I thought, after the tsunami hit the island, and then the Civil War, the LTTE, I think, oh my God, this is going to totally, break up this family system maybe. No way. I mean, it disrupted it while the war was going on. The tsunami temporarily made a big difference. The NGO organizations often mistakenly built houses, tsunami houses, and gave them to the men, even though it was the women who lost the house, right? But of course the women said, yeah, that's okay, take the house, husband. We'll give it to our daughter when she gets married. And that's what's happening. The houses got transferred, some of them to men, but that's not going to stay. So that is what I'm working on right now. Is sort of, then the comparisons with South India, where all along the Tamil Nadu coast, there's lots of Muslim communities. I was there actually doing fieldwork last year, where again the Muslim women own the property, and the men come and live with the wife.
You can actually see the same in Kerala also among Muslims.
Oh yeah,
and
Calicut and places like that.
And also matrilocality, and quite interesting because and very often not so educated people. And you ask them, so when a boy here gets married, he has to move into the. Is that common here in this area? No, only among Muslims. Only among Muslims, which is not how we normally think about Muslims.
Exactly. Yeah, precisely.
Questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a bit curious about the relationship between youth participants and the sheikh. You told earlier that if you ask people about the sheikh, they often have one. And I was wondering if this relationship, is it concerned around the youth's rearing, the child rearing, or is the sheikh sort of like a father figure? Or because if you look in some Sufi groups, at least you often find like the sheikh, he knows everything that goes around. He knows if someone has an illicit affair, even if he doesn't know, he pretends, sort of a certain power of knowledge.
I suspect it would be true in this case too, but I don't have sort of concrete case studies of that to be sure about. I did notice though, and I continue to see, the metaphor of the parent, the sheikh as the father. So my guy is Makatar Vapa. Vapa is the Tamil Muslim word for father. And so when he meets with his followers, and when I'm an honored guest, he'll basically arrange for food to be served in his house to all of the followers and to me. And the food comes in, and the tradition here is that for men, I guess it would be true for women too separately, is to eat from a common plate, usually called a sahan. So 6 people sitting around, 6 men sitting around from a large sort of tray, circular tray, and the food is put in the middle, and you you eat sort of simultaneously from a common plate, which again is so un-Hindu. So what does Bapa do? He serves it. He is the one that, with his own hand, puts the rice on the plate. He's the one with his own hand who serves the vegetable and the fish curry and whatever. He is the one who mixes it up as if a parent would mix food to feed a child. And then he calls his followers child.
It's a form of blessing.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just absolutely explicit. Father is feeding his children. And he talks about his followers not as his murids, but as his children. So it's a familial sort of kinship, household metaphor. It's very strong. I have a feeling that, he probably knows a lot about these guys too. They hang out with him a lot and dote upon him. So, yeah, I think you're onto something. Yeah.
Thank you for that talk. I had actually a couple of questions. The first was, if you're tracking transnational, transregional linkages, is there any linkage with Dargah Sharif in Ajmer and then in Nizamuddin? And that's the first question. Actually, more. The second is, just like the silsila, as you mentioned in Nagaur, even in Nizamuddin, the silsila is traced through Nizamuddin himself. So there are actually 4 families, one of whom has migrated to Pakistan, and there are 3 left, and they all share in the shrine's earnings. So I wanted to know how it works in Sri Lanka. How do the earnings, are they split amongst family? And the last question.
Wait a minute, I'm gonna lose track of the questions. The first question was what?
About whether the Sri Lankan and the Tamil Sufi networks have linkages with North India.
Okay, let me answer that quick. Yeah. Okay, so the answer is, I was surprised to learn fairly recently, in the last few years, that those connections are growing, but had not been there previously. I don't think. I mean, there's a sheikh whom I know fairly well that I didn't even mention, who fled the island for a few years when he was basically being attacked by Muslim Tawheed fundamentalist groups who accused him of, being a heretic for Sufism. And where did he flee to? Ajmer. He fled to Rajasthan, where he was welcomed in the Chishti order, and has since then come back, and he's now actually celebrating Chishti Urus at his mosque in Katanpuri. And apparently some of the Chishti family members from Ajmer now have traveled to Sri Lanka to sort of, enhance his celebration. Now, I haven't heard any Qawwali singing yet, but I'm astonished that this is happening. Never, when I was a younger scholar, did anyone had ever even heard of Ajmer, at least as far as I knew. So it is Chishti. The charisma of the Chishti order is so great that you simply cannot ignore it, even at the farthest reaches of Sri Lanka. My guy, the fellow with the cell phone, with the mobile phone, you ask him what is his tariqa, and he'll say Qadriya Shishti. And I don't know of anything particularly Shishti-like that he does, but he wants to borrow and participate in that Shishti tradition, and he's, I'm sure, gotten some kind of initiation himself from a Shishti sheikh. So yeah, it's growing. We'll see where it goes. Okay. Now the second question was.
The second was about how do they deal with the earnings in the Sri Lankan.
Okay. Very simple. There is nothing like that Dargah family property in Sri Lanka. Well, there's one. In Berwala, I know of one place where it may be developing now, where there's more of a corporate hereditary ownership of the Dargah, but it's rare. And as far as I know. It's the only example I know of is this one dargah in Baroda. Elsewhere, the idea of the saint's own descendants still managing the shrine just doesn't exist.
So where do the earnings go, the shrine earns?
Well, good question. There would be a committee of some kind, to run the place. One example is there is a shrine for Jilani, for Abdul Qadir Jilani. He's not buried, of course, in Sri Lanka. He's buried in Iraq, but he is believed to have visited Sri Lanka magically and meditated for 12 years in a cave up in the mountains of Sri Lanka. So there's an annual festival for him on his death anniversary. And the earnings from that shrine, there's basically a trustee board. It's registered, I think, with the Waqf's board, the Muslim endowments and the state's registry. But it's being run essentially the way a mosque would be run by a committee of local trustees. But they're not hereditarily related to the saint.
And my final question is, the whole practice of self-flagellation in that sense is also very similar and connected to what happens at Urs at Nizam, because I'm familiar with the Nizamuddin Dargah. And how I wonder if they go into a trance when they do all that, because the music induces that kind of, it's called hal in North India.
Yeah, hal, right. Sometimes they use the same word, hal.
Okay, so I just wanted to see if there were similar parallels in that sense. It's induced through music and through tempo and heartbeat.
This shrine that I mentioned, where the saint is believed to have meditated for 12 years up in the mountains of Sri Lanka, the high point, the most emotional moment in the whole festival is the raising of the flag on the first day. And before the flag is raised, someone, of course, has made a vow to donate the flag. And it's usually a green embroidered flag, with the La ilaha illallah or something on it. But at the right moment, the trustees and the leading members of that community who run the place dip their hands in sandalwood and do a handprint on the flag. And when that happens, people go crazy. I mean, it's like, like there's electricity in the air, and people are sort of fainting. It's this moment of hal, of sort of being overwhelmed with the presence of the saint. And then it gradually sort of calms down. 15 minutes later, the flag gets raised up, and okay, it's up at last. And now we can sort of be normal again. Yeah.
My question is, it might be a bit controversial. But you mentioned Saudi Sufi connection and Sri Lankan connection. But the thing is, how we see as Sufis in northern India or Kashmir, Saudi are anti-Sufis. But how is going on right now?
I may have misspoken. I didn't intend to say there was any Saudi connection.
Okay.
The Saudis are totally opposed to Sufism. And so the problem is, in fact, Saudi-inspired opposition to the Sufi traditions. That's where the conflict is. And when this fellow fled from Sri Lanka to Ajmer, I don't know the facts, but everyone says, and he says, it was the Wahhabi activists who chased me out.
I mean, that's another connection to the Middle East.
It is, that's right.
Can you develop a little bit how that affected the Sufi community?
Well, I mean, it's certainly something that has happened in my experience in the last 40 years. As I said, when I first went to Sri Lanka, and of course I didn't go to study Sufism, I didn't have it on my research agenda, but when I asked people eventually, are you a Sufi, or you know any Sufis, or what can you say about Sufis, and people just didn't know what I was talking about. That reflected, I think, a pre-Wahhabi world in which people were not aware of their Sufism because there wasn't an opposition to it. And it's only when sort of active, militant, anti-Sufi groups come into the scene that people learned that they were Sufis.
This was in 1970s or?
Yeah, well, I started in 1969, 1970. Now, by the late 80s, mid-90s, of course, everyone could use the word Sufi. But, 1970s, it just wasn't. I mean, I'm not saying there was nobody, who didn't know it, who knew what a Sufi was, but I didn't run into them, not in a rural setting. But, the Wahhabi-inspired opposition to Sufism quickly taught people that, oh, yeah, I guess I'm a Sufi, And initially, in the 80s and 90s, my diagnosis had been that Sufism was going to actually wither in Sri Lanka because the opposition to it from these militant groups was so strong. And even good friends of Muslim friends of mine were saying, oh, this Sufi thing, it's so old-fashioned and superstitious, and these bawas, they stick spikes in their eyeballs. I mean, this can't last, you're seeing the last of the bawas. Well, I keep going back, and there's new bawas, right? And now there's new Sufi organizations, young men who are organized, very strong pro-Sufi. So there's been a rebound on Sufism. It's interesting. And so now, if you're a kind of a Sufi sympathetic Muslim in Sri Lanka, you might say, I'm not Tawhid Jamaat. That's the fundamentalists. No, I am Sunnatul Jamaat. I am traditionalist. Meaning I do Islam the way my father did. We celebrate the saints' festivals, and we do our prayers in the traditional way. So even the guy who fled to Rajasthan, I could not believe. 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, I was in Sri Lanka. This is a man who had been forced out of the country, right? He's now building a 3-story brand new dargah for his father with an elevator, with all mud khans built in. He has got support from wealthy Muslims who are helping him build this thing. The Tawheed group are very opposed to it, but they're not prevailing. I mean, I'm saying the conflict is still there, but the Sufi side is showing its strength, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, now to hear from the Sri Lankan now.
Well, I also spent some time in the Eastern province, and I also met all these people that you have mentioned.
Yeah.
And last maybe 10 years before, something like this. And also the people that, as you categorize the Eastern and the Western, the Sufi traditions. In the Eastern province, the Sufi tradition, they don't, the people in the Western, the Sufi groups or tariqas, they don't accept them as a Sufis because they think that they are not, like non-Muslims. Even like 2 months before, there was a huge, the debate between these two groups. The one that who is in Katankuli, that Rauf, and one that, as you said, I think you mentioned, the young guy who is in Berwala.
What is his name?
Ahmad.
Yeah.
Sheikh Ahmad.
Yes, right.
Sheikh Ahmad, and he had a big conference against this this Abdul Rauf. And also the other one, Baidwan, is in the Eastern province.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, there's the inter-Sufi movements conflict. Like Abdul Rauf doesn't accept Pailwan as a Sufi, or the Pailwan doesn't accept Abdul Rauf as a Sufi. It is the same with Makatar Majid. That also, because when I met him, that he doesn't accept Abdul Rauf. When I talk to the Makatar. So there is a
Yeah. Well, you may know more than I do about that, because I don't recall hearing from Makatar strong anti-Rauf feelings. I know that this is, those of you who don't know who we're talking about, but there are two very controversial sheikhs. One is the fellow who fled to Rajasthan, Abdul Rauf, who is alive and building the 3-story mosque with the elevator. But the other one is a man popularly known as Pailwan, the wrestler. He died, and he was thought to be even more sort of controversial. And at the height of the tensions against Sufism, his body was exhumed from his dargah in Kathankudi and cremated, taken away by fundamentalist Muslims and disposed of secretly, allegedly by burning, because it was wrong that he should even be buried in Kathankudi. He was not a Muslim, polluting the soil of Kathankudi. Anyways, these are very, very controversial guys, and they all have a big ego. And I wouldn't be surprised if everyone has got a little criticism of somebody else. My feeling, though, is that Makatar is the most mellow of them all. I mean, of the ones I've met. He may be critical, but he doesn't condemn Ralph the way some of them do. But you may, as I said, you may actually know more about that than I do.
With the West and the people in the West, they don't accept that.
Sorry?
They don't accept
They don't accept the teaching.
those
and-
people that
yeah.
they are Sufis or something like this.
Yeah.
You know? These people are saying that you are in the wrong way of addressing Sufism. That's why there's now it's a current debate among in the Facebook and in some of the social media. A lot of discussions are going on. Who are the real Sufi?
And does it have to do with sort of theological doctrine?
Of course.
Yeah.
Because the theoretical doctrine is a lot of debated in the eastern province, among the Sufis. But among the Sufis in the western province, they don't much talk about this theological, the things. They just practice those what you said in the Friday nights and things.
Yeah. The issue, as I understood it, in the case of Abdul Rauf, who was chased out, is that he actively taught the doctrine of Wadat ul Wujud, sort of the pantheistic doctrine of Ibn Arabi, a very influential Sufi philosopher, who's incredibly influential throughout South Asia. So he wasn't teaching anything that was really that unusual, but from a strict sort of Saudi-inspired Wahhabi point of view, it's wrong.
But at the same time, the Western scholars, the recent 2 months before the discussion, the seminar, that Sheikh Ahmad said, what we accept what is Wahidatul Wujud is right, but Abdul Rauf teaching is not Wahidatul Wujud.
Okay, it's a different misinterpretation of the
Yes.
doctrine. Okay. Well, as I say, I mean, to really get into this would require me to really master the texts of Ibn Arabi and Hujwiri and all these other Sufi philosophers, and I don't think at my stage of scholarship I can spend the time doing
A
it.
young person.
But yes, but someone like you who can.
Right. Any other?
I'm curious about this Durabao you told me
Yeah.
last year. It's called Bawa Mujahideen. Is there some kind of like warrior identity in that, or what by that mean?
Oh, why they use the name Muhyiddin?
Yeah.
It's such a common Muslim name. Muhyiddin, I think, is one of the common epithets for Jilani, actually. Correct me if I'm wrong about that, Andreas. I think so.
Yeah.
And also, Ibn Arabi, I think, was also called Muhyiddin. I mean, it's another one of those words that, if in the right context, you could say, oh yeah, he's really referring to a really famous scholar or figure. But it's a very common name. Yeah. In fact, the word for the common word in Tamil, among Tamil-speaking Muslims, in my experience, for the saint Jilani, who's buried in Baghdad, is Muhyiddin Arndevar. Muhyiddin, the same thing. Arndevar meaning Lord, the ruler. Tamil word meaning ruler. It's not an Arabic word. So Muhyiddin Arndevar meaning Lord Muhyiddin. And it means Jilani. Thank you so much for these questions. I really appreciate your interest. I'll hang around a bit if you want to chat with me. I don't want to keep
And
it.
tomorrow we have another
Yes.
lecture at 4 o'clock at Palestra. It's just co-organized with UPF.